Today we are going to be reading from Exodus 4, 1 to 17. But Moses protested again. What if they won't believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord never appeared to you? Then the Lord asked him, what is that in your hand? A shepherd's staff, Moses replied. Throw it down on the ground, the Lord told him. So Moses threw down the staff, and it turned into a snake. Moses jumped back. Then the Lord told him, reach out and grab its tail. So Moses reached out and grabbed it, and it turned back into a shepherd's staff in his hand. Perform this sign, the Lord told him. Then they will believe that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, really has appeared to you. Then the Lord said to Moses, now put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand inside his cloak. When he took it out again, his hand was white as snow with a severe skin disease. Now put your hand back into your cloak, the Lord said. And when Moses put his hand back in, and when he took it out again, it was healthy as the rest of his body. The Lord said to Moses, if they do not believe you and are not convinced by the first miraculous sign, they'll be convinced by the second sign. And if they don't believe you or listen to you even after these two signs, take some water from the Nile River, pour it out on the dry ground. When you do, the water from the Nile will turn to blood on the ground. But Moses pleaded with the Lord, oh Lord, I'm not very good with words. I never have been, and I'm not now, even though you have spoken to me. I get tongue-tied, and my words get tangled. Then the Lord asked Moses, who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether people speak or do not speak, hear or do not hear, see or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to say. But Moses pleaded again, Lord, please send anyone else. And the Lord became angry with Moses. All right, he said, what about your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know he speaks well, and look, he's on his way to meet you now. He will be delighted to see you. Talk to him. Put the words in his mouth. I will be with both of you as you speak. I will instruct you both into what to do. Aaron will be your spokesman to the people. He will be your mouthpiece, and you will stand in the place of God for him, telling him what to say. And take your shepherd's staff with you, and use it to perform the miraculous signs I have shown you. Here ends the reading. Well, this week, we're picking up right where we left off last week, obviously. God has contacted Moses through the burning, not burning bush. And God said, Moses, got this little project I'd like for you to take on. He wanted Moses to go back to Pharaoh and ask him to let all the Hebrew slaves go. I mean, how big of a deal could that be, right? I mean, just the corner of the economy of the entire Egyptian nation. I'm sure Pharaoh will be very happy to grant the request of a man who was a Hebrew himself, grew up at Pharaoh's palace, where everybody knew he was a Hebrew. I'm sure Pharaoh will just have no problem wrecking his own economy to grant all these people their freedom. And if that wasn't enough, I'm also sure the Hebrews, who spent their whole lives working hard under Egyptian slave drivers, they're going to be super happy to follow the spoiled kid who grew up in the palace. They're going to be super happy to follow him out to the unknown. You know, there's going to be no resentment, no hostility, no anger on behalf of the people who have literally worked like slaves their whole life. They're not going to be upset with the kid who grew up in the palace, now has no scars, no injuries from a life of hard labor. I mean, what could possibly go wrong here? And on top of that, Moses, the man who grew up in the middle of these two cultures, between the Israelite and Egyptian cultures, but never belonged to either one of them, now has a wife, a son, a father-in-law he loves very much. He belongs here in Midian. Why would he ever want to leave this life? He's happy here. And these years with Zipporah and his son Gershom and his father-in-law Jethro out there in the wilderness, these were undoubtedly the most happiest times of his life, even compared to the time he lived in the palace. It's great. I mean, he was no longer living in the lap of luxury, of course, but he was living a life that made him authentically happy in Midian. Why would he want to leave? I mean, not a lot of motivation in anything I've said so far. Moses says to the voice from the burning, not burning bush, you're going to have to do a little better than this. Okay? You have to do a little better than just telling me your name. Especially since the name of God that the voice gives is a name nobody ever heard before. It isn't like today when I say Jesus and you all know who I'm talking about. You know, that's not how it works. No one had ever heard of Yahweh before. And even more bizarre, God's name is a verb. So if I came to you after church today and said, hey, somebody told me that you're supposed to do something, how excited are you going to be when I tell you that the person who told me to tell you to do something's name was Jump? Hey, Jump told me to tell you to give me $5. How many of you are going for the wallet at that point? That's right, none of you. I get it, right? So Moses is not excited about this at all. And as you can see, he has a bunch of concerns, of which God is not surprised by any of them. Because God knows he's asking Moses for a lot here. Moses has concerns. Why wouldn't he? This is crazy. I mean, this is a pretty crazy thing that God has asked him to do. So God set up a series of proofs to help Moses overcome his doubt. Now, before I launch into these 5 concerns that we all have when presented with God's plan, I want a moment of privilege here. Can we take just a moment and appreciate how beautiful this story is? Reading it over this past week, getting ready for this morning, I never really took time to marinate with this story before, to realize just how beautiful this is. This is not God forcing himself on Moses. This is God inviting Moses to be a part of something great. If God was going to force Moses to go to Egypt, then there never would have been a burning, not burning bush. God would have just Shazammed Moses to Egypt and we would have went from there. The whole reason we have this story at all is because this is God and Moses having a conversation. Beautiful. But in the midst of this conversation, Moses is worried about a few things. And he's worried about the same 5 things all of us are worried about. These are the 5 concerns we all have when we're called by God to do something. So anytime you're wrestling with a call from God, these are the concerns you'll have. Now, you may not have them in the same order that Moses has them, but as somebody who's experienced a call from God many times in my life, I can tell you these are the stages of concern that you go through, okay? And this is how they work. The first concern is fear. Now, Moses is about to go home from this burning, not burning bush conversation and tell his wife, sweetheart, something I have to do. It's going to sound crazy when I say it. That's the conversation. That's the first conversation he's faced with. And the idea is he's now going to go back and stand between these 2 groups of people who the only thing they agree on is they both want him dead. Nobody likes him. And he's going to do this because a burning, not burning bush told him to do it. I think there's plenty of things to be concerned about here. So God represents Moses' fear in the form of a snake. Now, this is one thing that we do see illustrated in Genesis very well, and that is people and snakes have had a very difficult relationship, clear back from the beginning. So in our world today, more people are afraid of snakes than just about anything else. So in this passage, where does Moses' fear come from? It comes from his own hand. God says, what's that in your hand? What, can God not see what's in his hand? Moses says, what, this? It's my shepherd's staff. Again, not surprising, because that's what Moses was doing up there on the mountain when he runs into the burning, not burning bush. He's doing the shepherding thing, so he has the staff. God says, throw it down. Throw it on the ground. Moses did. Throws it on the ground, and it turns into a snake. This is the very same staff that Moses has been carrying around, for years at least, probably had it for a long time. He used it. He defended the sheep with it. The staff was familiar. He understood it. It was always around him. He carried it with him everywhere he went. But God said, no, distance yourself from it. Throw it on the ground. In that moment, God showed Moses something he'd never considered before. And that is the source of his own fear was right in his hand the whole time. He carried that fear with him everywhere he went. He could have thrown that staff down anytime he wanted, but he diligently carried that fear with him in his hand the whole time. The fear that Moses had came from lots of sources. It came from his past, his current experiences, and those things were real. So God says, Moses, look, you're carrying it with you. The thing you're afraid of, there it is. Now it's a snake once you get back away from it. So when Moses' staff became a snake, it became a representation of Moses' fear, which he has a lot of at this point. God said, there it is, Moses. What you've been fearing the whole time. It's been in your hand the whole time. Carried that fear with you every place you went. In this case, for him, it was a staff. But Moses' fear ran way deeper than just a stick. He had doubt, feelings of inadequacy. He had questions about who he was and what he meant to people. He had painful memories. He'd had painful experiences. And he was carrying all that stuff with him everywhere he went. Never allowed himself to be distanced from his fear. God says, Moses, cast those fears on the ground. Why? Because God gets to decide what's happening here. And Moses, regardless of what you have been taught, regardless of what you have learned about yourself, do not ever allow fear to restrict you. Because as you can see, there's a lot of fear going on. Moses throws his staff on the ground. He sees it become a snake right there on the ground. Now Moses sees his fear on the ground. And his first instinct, once he realizes it, is to run from it. I think any of us would have had that response. But in preparing Moses to respond to God's calling, God was going to need to break Moses of the fear he carried. Because he carried a lot, just like he carried that staff. So the staff becoming a snake represented all of Moses' doubt, fear, inadequacy, questions, painful memories, painful experience, all this stuff was now represented by the snake on the ground. Remember how Moses grew up, caught between two cultures while belonging to neither. He had to run from that life because both sides hated him. Moses had plenty of things to fear. God needed him to face those fears in order to see that fears only lived because Moses never put them down. Throw the fear away, Moses. And this morning, I say the same thing to you. Give God a chance to show you the nature of your fear, because what you might learn is that fear you have is only there because you keep carrying it around. Once God revealed to Moses the fear was in his hand, now it was time to conquer the fear. What does God say next? He says, Moses, see that fearsome snake? I want you to pick it up. Conquer the fear. That fear doesn't own you. You own the fear because you're the one that's been carrying it the whole time. God says, pick that fear up by its tail. Now, I am not a snake handler. I have many strange talents, but snake handling is not one of them. But if for whatever reason I was ever inclined to go grab a snake, I don't think I would grab it by the tail. Would you like to know why? Because the snake will swing back and bite you. Representing the one thing I don't want to happen. If you grab a snake, you grab it so it can't bite you. How do you grab it? By the head. God says, Moses, grab the fear at the most dangerous place. And when Moses grabbed it and did something that seems pretty risky, it was a staff again. AKA, staffs don't bite you. Who is in control of your fear? God made it clear, you are. Moses had plenty to be afraid of here. And God showed Moses that the path to conquering fear is to see it for what it is. Don't be afraid to grab a hold of that fear with authority, because fear has no more authority than you're willing to give it. And that's what God needed Moses to see. Grab the fear, pick it back up. That's the first thing Moses conquered. Next, God says, Moses, put your hand inside your robe. When he pulled it out, it was covered with leprosy or some kind of skin disease. This is the second concern that we have when we consider a call from God. It is our health. We are afraid for our health. Now, this is a concern that's a bit troublesome because there are plenty of times when our health does not go the way we want it to. Friends, I had 2 funerals this past week. So I've had stark reminders that not all health problems go the way we want them to go. But what God is showing Moses is that health problems, they're going to happen. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but it's true today. There are times when our health or the health of the people that we love, it's going to be threatened. It's going to happen. It's a frightening reality. And I get it. We don't like it, but that's a part of living in the world. What God is showing Moses is, doesn't matter. No matter if your hand is infected with this disease or if it's not, I want you to be faithful. We're not going to worry about the rest of this. Health problems are going to come. Health problems are going to go. That should never determine our response to God's call, because those health problems are going to come and they're going to go, regardless of what we do about God's call. So you can sit on the sidelines and lament the fact that sickness happens, or You can get involved in building God's kingdom by investing every healthy day that you have, fulfilling God's call in your life. For those, and again, I don't know how long it was, a couple of seconds or whatever, that Moses had leprosy, and then when he no longer had it anymore, God's call was still real. Moses' physical health was not a factor in what God was asking him to do. God was asking for faithfulness in sickness and in health. And that's exactly what he was illustrating. Leprosy, it wasn't like God said, whoa, never mind, my bad. He didn't say that. Didn't matter what his health was. Go forward and do it. Here's the third concern that we've run into. And this is an interesting one because I really had to consider this one a lot this week because I couldn't make any sense of this third sign. In verse 9, God tells Moses to take water for the Nile River, pour it on the ground, and it will become blood. I kept thinking, what in the world concern is God addressing here? I actually thought about this for a couple of days before I realized what was going on. Friends, where is Moses? He's on Mount Sinai. He is nowhere near the Nile River. Now, obviously, since we all know the story, this is a foreshadowing of the plagues, so I don't want to get too much into that. But this one makes no sense until I realize the fact that it actually does make no sense. This is the concern that God is addressing. When responding to God's call, we all fear the unknown. I have no idea why the water would turn to blood. I have no idea why God references that at this point in the story. But even Moses would be like when God says, take the water from the Nile and pour it out. Even Moses is saying, God, do you have any idea how far the Nile River is from here? I mean, I walked that distance. I know how far it is. But I'm nowhere near that now. Friends, God is addressing the unknown in his conversation with Moses. Yes, Moses, guess what? There are going to be parts of my plan that you're not going to understand. Before this is over, you're going to see frogs materialize out of thin air. You're going to meet the angel of death. And wait till you see my incredible drainage program I'm going to use on the Red Sea. You're going to be really impressed. Friends, there's no way Moses could understand any of that yet. But God was letting Moses know that understanding is not required for him to respond. He can still say yes, even if he doesn't understand what he's doing. My friends, there are plenty of stuff that we don't understand about God's call, but that should never be a reason for us to ignore it. That's the third concern. The fourth concern that Moses brings up is that he is afraid. He is not up to the task. I think that this concern is legitimate because Moses, in his situation, he's going to go to two groups of people, the Israelites and the Egyptians, and both of them hate him. And the reason he's going back to that situation is because a disembodied voice from a burning, not burning bush told him to go do it. I think there's plenty to be concerned about in this situation. Moses is afraid of speaking because he gets tongue-tied. God says, you realize where this all comes from, right? I mean, you realize I'm the one that's empowering you, right? And this goes back to what we talked about last week. God is the one who does the work. We're just called to be faithfully present. God is going to do an amazing thing. God is only giving us the responsibility to be faithful. All the miracle working, that's God's problem. He isn't expecting us to do any of the miracles without help. When Moses voices concern about his own ability, think about what he's questioning. He's questioning God's design. When we don't faithfully respond to God's legitimate call, we are questioning God's design of us. Do you think that God is unaware of your strengths and weaknesses? He's the one that gave them to you. Of course he knows. When you don't respond to God's call because you don't think you're up to the task, think about what you're saying to God. God, I think you blew this one. You got the wrong guy. You're questioning his knowledge. You're questioning his understanding of you. Friends, that's not a place you want to be. If God called us, he is planning to work through us to build his kingdom. And if that's what he called us to do, make no mistake, his grace is sufficient. And that's how that works. That's the fourth concern. Then we come to the fifth concern. And this is where it gets difficult. Moses finally tells the truth. What does he say? Moses says, God, I don't want to. I'd rather you go get somebody else. Of all the concerns on the list, my friends, this one is by far the most common. He calls us, and we really think that this is a great idea, God. You are calling us to something fantastic. This is something we certainly should see somebody go do. This is great. Here's what I think you ought to do, God. Go find somebody else. I won't speak for you, but there have been plenty of times in my life that God gave me the nudge. Y'all know the nudge, right? And this was my response. Yeah, I don't want to. When I look at the state of the world today, I almost wonder if I don't want to is the most common of all responses to God's call. Because there are two problems with this concern, and let me talk about them both. The first thing is, God has a really hard time overcoming this one. If you'll notice, what God did when Moses said, I don't want to, is God said, fine, I'll give you your last concern, all right? Here's your brother Aaron. He can go with you and talk, all right? He's actually going back to a previous concern. He's not addressing this one. Now, I want to say this here. I want to bring this detail out here because it's going to become very significant later in the story. So I'm just going to say it here and we'll come back to it in a couple weeks. Why is Aaron here? Why does Aaron go on this adventure at all? Aaron is there because Moses is afraid of being able to speak. He does not speak eloquently. So Aaron is brought in to be the spokesperson. So the only reason that Aaron is here is because he's good at thinking on his feet. He's got a great public presence. He's able to speak fluently and come up with things. Keep that in mind because that detail is going to come back later in the story. But that was Moses' concern, previous concern. So God says, fine, I'll send Aaron if that will make it all better. Of all the concerns on this list, God has a specific supernatural response to all of them except lack of desire. God doesn't make Moses want to. All the rest of the concerns are acceptable and okay. God has a specific response to all of them but this one. Is it any wonder why this response is the most common? If God can address all the other concerns on the list but this one, then lack of desire becomes Satan's most go-to temptation we have when we're presented with a call from God. Of course it's that one, because that's the hardest one that God has to respond to. But there's a second piece here. Did you notice in this whole passage I read, God never gets angry with Moses until this one. No anger up till this point. Moses had all these doubts and questions and concerns. He makes up excuses, and he comes up with all these reasons, and God patiently works through all of them. Each one of them addressing Moses' legitimate concern. He never gets angry with Moses till Moses says, I'd rather not. I want to get into why God is angry in just a second, but before I get to the answer to the why question, I want to say a word about what. God has no recourse here. Moses has literally backed God into a corner, but God does not give up on Moses. If God came to you in the past, at some point in the past, he laid a calling on your life, a burden you needed to go do something about, and you have been, shall we say, less than enthusiastic about going to do it, rest assured that did not cancel the call. Now, there are times when a window of opportunity on a certain call may run out, but if God has called you to something big, the call will remain active for as long as it takes. The specifics of the call might come and go depending on the time and opportunity, but the calling itself never goes away. No matter how long you let it sit or try to deny its existence, that calling will stay. That's the what. Here's the why. Why does being honest with God about not wanting to go, why does that make God angry? Because you can see that God was perfectly fine with everything Moses said, all of his questions, all of his doubts, all of his current. God patiently went through them all till this one. Why did Moses telling God the truth that he didn't want to do that? Why is God mad now? See, I said this last week, and I still maintain this for this week. God doesn't need Moses for this job. Of all the big points of the Exodus story, God needs nothing from Moses to bring about the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the delivery of the Ten Commandments. All Moses is there to do is to keep the people focused on God so they know what they're witnessing is God's action. Honestly, it's a fairly easy job that anybody could do. So when God gets angry, I don't think that that's God saying, oh, shucks, Moses, I can't do this without you. I don't think God is saying that. I believe that this is the case, is that God could get the people out of Egypt without Moses. That could happen. So the reason that God is angry here is the same reason that parents get frustrated with their kids. You know, as parents, you see something that would be good for your kids, and they just won't do it. Either something that they should stay away from, that they're attracted to like a moth to the flame, or something they should do that they're repelled to like two North Pole magnets. That's the frustration. Because the experience, you want that for them. It would be enriching for them. It would be good for them, but they just don't want to do it. That's why God calls us. See, there is no doubt that there is not a single thing on this earth that God needs our help to do. But there are a ton of good experiences out there. Evidences of His goodness that He wants us to experience. And that's why He calls us. Friends, I can tell you with complete confidence, standing right where I'm standing this morning, if 25 years of working in churches has taught me anything beyond a shadow of a doubt, it is this. Is that when God called Tim to come do this job 29 years ago, that call had not a single thing to do with my talent, my ability, my intelligence, my wisdom, my wit, or my appearance. Had nothing to do with that. What God said is He looked at me and said, there's some stuff that I needed to see. There were some experiences that I needed to have. There were some situations in which I needed to be involved. Why? So that I would be able to further understand the mysterious and awesome nature of the God that I serve. That's the only reason I was there. Now, friends, there have been plenty of days along the way that I wish I would have stuck to my guns when I first said, God, I don't want to do this. Honestly, there have been more bad days than good in the past 29 years. That's just the truth. But if I was still today holding out on the calling that I had, and resisted doing what God has asked me to do, then there would be a whole lot about God that I would not know today. Now, I can't honestly tell you whether or not there's been a single situation that would have worked out differently with me or without me, but I do know this. I would not be the person I am today, for better or for worse, had I not allowed God to talk me into doing something insane 29 years ago. And even though in the last 29 years, I still occasionally wonder if God didn't dial the wrong number that night. That's neither here nor there. Friends, let me close with this. The experience of God, that's what you cheat yourself out of when you pass on His calling. You cheat God out of the chance to show you something amazing. And the only person who loses out in that scenario is you. Because whatever it is God wants to do, He can do it without you. It's no problem at all. But there's an experience. There's a realization. There's a learning. There's an eye-opening something there that God wants for you. That's why He wants you involved. God didn't want Moses to miss the miracle of saving the Israelites. That's why God called Moses from the burning, not burning bush. So, my friends, a calling from God. It's not about what you do. A calling from God is about what you're going to miss if you don't. So go forward and respond faithfully in Jesus' name. Amen.